Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about an HOA that demands that I pay rent for my warehouse near my house. I've always been the kind of person who doesn't focus too much on appearance. I own a couple of pairs of jeans and some plain shirts, and that's pretty much my entire wardrobe. When I work on my projects, I don't mind getting grease or paint on my clothes. In fact, most of my shirts end up with some kind of stain on them by the end of the week. The way I see it, clothes are just clothes, and my priority is getting my tasks done. I guess that's what started this whole bizarre situation with my warehouse. Let me set the stage. I live in a neighborhood that's governed by a very uptight HOA. It's a place that tries to have a polished image for every single house and yard. Some folks buy into that mindset wholeheartedly. I do not. I bought a small ranch-style house years ago when I was in a slightly more comfortable financial position, and I happen to own a warehouse about 10 minutes away. I use that warehouse as a workshop and a space for my personal hobbies and side business. When I'm tinkering with cars or working on furniture restoration projects, my on and off side gig, you can bet I'm wearing comfortable overalls with a few holes or ratty t-shirts with paint splatters. Some people might see that and think I'm short on funds or something. The reality is, I just don't care to spend money on brand new clothes I'm going to mess up anyway. For the first few years, I never had an issue with the HOA or any neighbors around the warehouse. I pretty much kept to myself. That warehouse isn't in a residential zone per se, but there's a small street of townhouses across from it. So there is a separate association that tries to enforce certain things in that area. My warehouse building predates the construction of the townhouses by decades, so I never had to belong to their HOA. Everything was peaceful. Until recently, I began noticing little signs of trouble. On a couple of weekends, I saw that folks in that townhouse association were walking around with clipboards, taking pictures of different buildings in the area. I spotted them snapping photos of my warehouse, which is a sturdy brick structure with a roller door, plus a small fenced lot where I sometimes park my truck. I stepped outside once to ask what they were doing, and one of the men, his name turned out to be Daryl, told me they were just conducting an aesthetic compliance survey. I asked if that had something to do with me, since my warehouse wasn't part of their housing development. He said not to worry about it, it was just routine. I shrugged and went back to cleaning engine parts. Things got weirder. About 2 months ago, I came to my warehouse on a random Tuesday, wearing my usual stained overalls, to pick up some new sets of cabinet doors I'd been refinishing for a client. As I was carrying a heavy door to my truck, an older woman named Gretchen, someone I'd never talked to in my life, approached me looking absolutely livid. She had a big ring of keys in one hand and a thick file folder in the other. She demanded to know what I was doing near our property. Naturally, I responded in confusion. This is my warehouse. I'm the owner. She waved her folder around and told me she had no record of me being on the local property registry for the townhouse community. I explained that's because my warehouse is not part of their properties at all. She didn't believe me, her face turning all red and flustered. She then insisted that if I wanted to rent the place, I would have to go through the association's official process. I couldn't help but laugh. I tried to politely clarify that she was mistaken, that my family had owned this warehouse for years, but she refused to accept it and stormed off, muttering something about people disrespecting the association's rules. At that point, I thought it was a silly misunderstanding. Maybe the HOA was in the middle of reorganizing records, or there was some confusion about property lines. I told myself it would blow over. I was wrong. A few days later, I received a formal-looking letter in the mail with the association's letterhead, stating that I was in violation of their guidelines and that, since I had not applied for formal occupancy nor paid the monthly community fee, I was subject to a $500 penalty. Additionally, I was told that I must pay past due rent for the last 6 months, which added up to some outrageous figure. The letter warned that if I didn't respond within 15 days, further action would be taken. I kept reading it, flabbergasted. It looked official, but it cited guidelines that did not apply to my standalone warehouse. The letter also mentioned that I had to cease and desist from using the space for business activities until I got the proper permits from them. None of this made sense. My warehouse predates that community's existence, and I have my own local business permits that have nothing to do with the townhouse association. So I decided I'd try once more to calmly sort it out. I visited the HOA office next to the townhouse complex, unannounced, in the same clothes I'd wear at the warehouse. I'm sure I looked a bit messy, but I was determined to talk it through. The receptionist looked at me oddly, like I was a random person who'd wandered in off the street. When I told her my name and explained that I was there to address the letter about my warehouse, she took a moment, rifled through some papers, and then gave me this judgmental frown. She said, "Actually, we have it here that the warehouse belongs to a member named Peter, who's up to date on all his fees. Perhaps you're mistaken." I was shocked. Peter was a name I'd never heard connected to my property. I asked to speak with someone higher up. She told me I'd have to come back at a scheduled time. I asked if I could make an appointment. She shrugged and said it would be better if I waited for a written reply from the board. Then she gave me this tight, condescending smile, as if I should just accept being brushed off. I left, more annoyed than before. The next few days were quiet, but I was tense, waiting for some weird new development. Sure enough, I found multiple notes stuck to the warehouse door, all with that same stock phrase. "This property is recognized by the Townhouse Association as belonging to a resident and is subject to monthly dues. Failure to pay or respond can result in further action." At that point, I felt like they were crossing a line. I contacted a friend of mine, Kathy, who used to work in real estate. She confirmed that my property record was correct with the county. She also pointed out that the Townhouse Association had no authority to demand rent from me. She suggested that if they persisted, I might have to get an attorney. I tried to keep a level head, but then came the day I actually caught someone messing with my lock. I had arrived early one Saturday morning to open up the warehouse. As soon as I turned onto the street, I saw a man fiddling with the front door lock. My old, weathered padlock had clearly been tampered with. I slammed my truck into park and jumped out. The man, who turned out to be the same Daryl I'd seen once before with the clipboard, gave me a startled look. He tried to cover by saying, "Oh, I was just checking for break-ins." I asked him outright why he was messing with my lock. He scowled and said, "We have reason to believe you're illegally occupying this building, and since the rightful occupant, Peter, has reported it stolen, I'm here on the board's authority to investigate." My jaw dropped. I told him in no uncertain terms that this was my warehouse and he was trespassing. When he refused to leave, I pulled out my phone and threatened to call the police. He huffed, saying, "Go ahead, but you'll see we're the rightful authority around here." Then he stomped off. At that moment, I realized there might be some bigger scheme going on. Could it be that some neighbor named Peter was claiming my warehouse as his own? It didn't make any sense. Even if he wanted to claim the property, wouldn't the county records prove he was lying? Why was the HOA so quick to believe him? Confused and stressed, I had new locks installed that same day. The following week, the harassment increased. I caught Daryl and Gretchen multiple times skulking around the warehouse, taking photos. They would shout at me from across the street, "Just pay your rent," or "We'll evict you soon." One day, as I was loading a refinished desk into my truck, a tall, bald guy in a bright polo shirt came up to me with a smug expression. He introduced himself as Byron and claimed he was a representative of the board. He said that I was behind schedule on rent payments and gave me a final warning that I'd be locked out of the building if I didn't comply. I told him bluntly that they had no legal right to do this. He responded, "Our lawyers will handle it." Things only got more surreal when a neighbor from across the street walked over. This neighbor, who had apparently been watching the entire exchange, decided to insert himself into the conversation. He introduced himself as Peter, the same name the HOA had mentioned. Without skipping a beat, he pointed to the warehouse and said, "I own that building, and this guy here is trespassing. We've told him to leave, but he keeps breaking in." Now, I'm usually a calm person, but that lit a fire in me. I turned to Peter and said, "This is my property. I have the deed. I pay the taxes. You're lying." Peter smirked like he wasn't worried in the slightest. Then, unbelievably, he called out to Byron, "Get him out of here. I'll call the authorities if he doesn't leave right now." Well, that was the last straw for me. I finally pulled out my phone and dialed the police on the spot. As soon as the dispatcher answered, I explained that someone was actively trespassing on my property and claiming it was his. Byron and Peter both looked like they wanted to protest, but I spoke loudly so they could hear me describing the situation. The dispatcher said she would send someone right away. While we waited, Peter tried to puff himself up, telling me he had connections in the county assessor's office and that I was making a huge mistake. Byron stood close by, arms crossed, occasionally shaking his head at me like I was some kind of rebellious tenant. When the officer arrived, I laid out the official documents I keep in my truck, a copy of the deed, the county tax forms, the warehouse's property lines, everything. I always keep extras because I've had potential buyers or tenants ask about the property in the past. Once the officer glanced at my paperwork, he asked to see Peter's supposed proof of ownership. Peter was suddenly flustered, muttering something about how the documents were at home. The officer asked for an address. Peter fidgeted and claimed he didn't have them on hand because he never thought he'd need to prove what's obviously his. The officer asked a few more questions, and Peter kept contradicting himself. Eventually, the officer told him to step away. Then the officer turned to me and said, "Sir, you appear to be the lawful owner. I'll need both of you to provide statements." So we did, right there on the curb. Byron tried to interject, claiming the Townhouse Association had some special rights, but the officer told him that he needed actual legal documents showing the warehouse belonged to the association. Byron said something about, "We have them in the HOA office," but refused to go get them, which told the officer everything he needed to know. In the end, the police officer warned Peter and Byron that if they tried to enter or tamper with my property again, they could be arrested for trespassing. He also told them that making false claims about ownership could lead to serious legal consequences. Then he advised me to keep the locks secure and to contact a lawyer if they continued to harass me. I was relieved to see them slink away. But it didn't end there, because apparently these folks never learned their lesson. Over the next few days, the HOA began sending me new letters, this time claiming that I was causing a public nuisance by running a business that created too much noise and smelled of chemicals. They threatened fines and said they would report me to the county health department. My reaction was to take a bunch of photos and videos of the inside of my warehouse, where I had proper ventilation, no foul chemical use, and an extremely organized space. I also invited the fire marshal for an inspection, just to cover my bases. He came by, did a quick walkthrough, and gave me a thumbs up, saying everything was up to code. Meanwhile, I spoke to my attorney friend Mitch, who said we could file a cease and desist letter against the HOA, and possibly even a harassment complaint. Mitch suggested, before going that route, that we try something more direct, a strongly worded letter referencing the local property laws, reminding them that the warehouse isn't in their jurisdiction and that continuing to harass me could lead to a civil lawsuit. Mitch helped me draft the letter, citing the relevant property statutes. We sent it to the HOA board via certified mail. For about a week, nothing happened. I almost let out a sigh of relief, thinking maybe they finally realized I wasn't someone to push around. Then, on a Sunday morning, I got a call from my caretaker, my cousin Connor, who sometimes helps me with tasks at the warehouse. He told me that someone had vandalized the outside. I rushed over to see graffiti reading, "Pay your rent," scrawled across the garage door. I was furious. I took pictures from every angle and called the police again to report it. They couldn't prove who did it, but I had my suspicions. With the letters and the repeated harassment, it was pretty clear the HOA or someone closely tied to them was behind it. That same day, I spent hours repainting the door. While I worked, I noticed a couple of people from the townhouse side standing at their windows, watching me. I even heard a muffled voice call out, "Serves you right." I tried to ignore it. Now, around this time, a few neighbors who lived near the warehouse but weren't part of the townhouse association started sharing their own stories. They'd noticed the HOA folks creeping onto their lots as well, claiming some obscure rights or trying to impose new fees. One neighbor, Rosie, who's in her late 70s and owns a small orchard down the road, said that a board member had tried to tell her she needed to trim her trees so they didn't block the scenic view for the townhouse residents. Rosie basically told them to take a hike. All of these stories convinced me that the HOA was power-hungry, trying to expand their domain by intimidation, and they had found a willing stooge in Peter, who for some reason was determined to claim my warehouse for himself. Maybe he thought he could bully me into giving it up, or maybe he planned on flipping it for a profit. Either way, I wasn't going to let them get away with it. Plot twist number 1 arrived in the form of my cousin Connor discovering something quite telling. The HOA had approved a large commercial development project on the other side of the townhouse complex. They'd apparently negotiated some arrangement that gave them partial oversight of properties in a broad swath around the development. But that zone did not legally include my warehouse. However, the association's new bylaws, which they quietly passed, contained language that implied the association believed they could acquire neglected or unoccupied buildings in that region, probably to sell or lease them to new businesses. This was presumably how they planned to jumpstart their finances. Connor pointed out that they might be targeting my warehouse because they believed it was infrequently used. After all, I didn't come around every day, and on some weekends I was away at trade shows, so it might have seemed abandoned to them. They saw my casual dress, my old pickup truck, and decided I wasn't likely to push back legally. If that was their assumption, they definitely miscalculated. That was all I needed to know to take serious action. My next step was to hire a professional surveyor to reaffirm the exact property lines. This surveyor not only measured the boundary of my land, but also placed clear, permanent markers. By the end of that process, I had an airtight case that my warehouse was decidedly outside the HOA's domain. I also got an official statement from the county property office verifying that they recognized me as the owner. When I presented these documents to my attorney friend Mitch, we compiled a letter, this time a more official one on his law firm's letterhead, stating that if the HOA continued any form of harassment, trespassing, or false claims of ownership, we would seek immediate injunctive relief and damages. We then requested a formal meeting with the HOA board. They responded, telling me that, per their guidelines, I needed to appear at their next open board session to discuss violations. I decided to attend, if only to squash their nonsense once and for all. The day of the meeting arrived. I showed up in my usual attire, faded jeans, a t-shirt, some oil stains on my sneakers. The board members, dressed in business casual, looked me up and down like I was scum on the bottom of their shoes. The auditorium was half filled with residents, many of whom seemed bored or uninterested. They put me last on the agenda. When they finally called my name, Byron introduced me by saying something about the alleged occupant of a disputed structure. That was my first clue they were still in denial. I stood at the microphone and calmly distributed copies of my documents to the board members. I explained in no uncertain terms that my warehouse was built before the townhouse community existed, that I possessed the deed, and that the county recognized my ownership. I also presented the letter from my attorney. At that point, Byron tried to claim they had a bylaw that gave them a right of first refusal on any property within a certain radius. He said that meant I had to either pay monthly dues or surrender partial ownership to the association. I told him that was absolutely not how property laws worked. I pointed out that no county record or state law gave them that right, and that, ironically, their own covenant stated it only applied to properties that were part of the association from the beginning or that voluntarily joined. My warehouse had never been part of it. Peter was there too, sitting off to the side. He tried to speak up and say, "I have an agreement with the original owner that," but I cut him off by stating, "I am the original owner's relative and inheritor. There's no agreement. You're lying." I showed the board a copy of the original purchase documents, which had my father's signature. We'd owned that building for decades. Gretchen, looking visibly irritated, said, "Well, how do we know those documents are legitimate?" Mitch, who had joined me for the meeting, stood up and introduced himself as my legal counsel. He calmly informed them that if they questioned the legitimacy, they were free to check with the county records office, which they obviously had not done. He also reminded them that continuing to make unfounded claims could land them in serious trouble. At that point, several residents in the audience started muttering. Some seemed annoyed at the board for dragging out the meeting with such a flimsy case. Others seemed to side with the board, probably out of loyalty or ignorance. But it was clear the board wasn't winning any supporters with their bizarre stance. Mitch concluded by reading our prepared statement. Any further attempts by the association or its members to claim ownership, impose fees, trespass on, or damage the property in question will result in legal action without further notice. We trust this concludes the matter. We left without waiting for their response. The next day, we received an email from the association's general inbox stating that they were dropping all claims regarding my warehouse. They insisted that they were acting in good faith based on the information provided by Peter, but they assured me they would refrain from any further attempts to collect rent or impose penalties. I thought that was the end. But remember how I said I wanted some justice or punishment for the people who had made my life miserable? Well, apparently the story didn't end for the HOA. Several of the more reasonable residents started digging into the board's financial decisions and discovered all sorts of questionable activities. The board had authorized expensive landscaping projects, new signage, and was funneling money into legal consultations to try and expand their boundaries. They used the association's funds without majority approval. People demanded transparency. The board's shady behavior was exposed at a public forum a month later. leading to an overwhelming vote to remove Byron and Gretchen from their positions. Daryl, who was heavily involved in harassing me, ended up stepping down as well. As for Peter, it came to light that he had numerous complaints against him for harassment, false claims, and was also behind on his own HOA dues. Some neighbors told me he was trying to do the same stunt with other unoccupied buildings in the area, though none were quite as big as my warehouse. Eventually, the association's new board sent him a cease and desist letter, warning that if he continued harassing property owners, he'd be taken to court. I'm not sure if he faced direct legal charges, but from what I've heard, he's extremely unpopular in the neighborhood now. Most people actively avoid him. There was talk about him leaving the townhouse altogether, although last I checked, he was still there, sulking behind closed curtains. With the board leadership replaced and the new members taking a more sensible approach, I haven't had any new issues. In fact, the new president of the association, a woman named Linda, reached out to me personally to apologize for the trouble. She even asked if I'd be interested in hosting a community workshop in my warehouse for local kids who wanted to learn about carpentry. I politely declined for the time being. Given everything that happened, I'm not ready to open my doors to them. But it was a nice gesture. I feel satisfied with the outcome. They got rid of the tyrannical board members, Peter's scheme was exposed, and I can finally work in peace. I do keep a security camera installed now, just in case. And every time I open my warehouse wearing my beloved stained overalls, I have a little grin on my face, knowing that not only do I own this place outright, but no meddling HOA can do anything about it. In the weeks following the board's collapse, I learned that some of my other neighbors had also been strong-armed or pressured into paying fees or making donations to the association. With Byron and Gretchen gone, those shady practices vanished. The new leadership is apparently focusing on legitimate neighborhood concerns, like street lighting and road repair, instead of controlling everyone's property. Meanwhile, I've expanded my furniture restoration business and even hired Connor part-time to help. We've started advertising our refurbishing services online, and it's been picking up nicely. I bought a couple more tools, reorganized the space for efficiency, and fixed up the front exterior to look a little more welcoming. Just because I wanted to, not because some association told me to. I never did figure out Peter's exact motive. Maybe he thought he could stake a claim and get a quick payout. Maybe he was in cahoots with the old board members who saw my warehouse as a golden goose for their bigger commercial plans. Whatever the reason, they shot themselves in the foot by trying to intimidate me. You can't just decide someone else's property belongs to you because you don't like how they dress or how often you see them there. I've taken extra steps to make it abundantly clear that I own the warehouse. New signage out front with my business name, registered with the county. A big sign saying, "Private property, no trespassing." And I have a 24/7 video surveillance system that sends footage to a cloud server. If anyone tries to do anything like that again, I'll have them on camera. I have a feeling this fiasco may have taught that HOA a lesson about overstepping boundaries. At the very least, it's made them realize that not everyone is going to cower under their demands. Some of us actually know our rights, and some of us aren't afraid to fight back. Reflecting on all of it now, it was a truly bizarre journey. From receiving nonsensical rent bills for my own warehouse, to dealing with vandalism, to watching the board's meltdown when confronted with real legal documents. I learned how crucial it is to have your paperwork in order and to stand your ground, even if you're up against a group of people who seem convinced they can bully you. It also reminded me that appearances can be deceiving. I might look like the scruffy, messy mechanic who's too poor to own a commercial building, but that doesn't change the fact that I do. My father, rest his soul, bought that warehouse decades ago to start a family-run auto repair shop, but we transitioned it into a general-purpose workshop after he retired. Now it's both a sentimental treasure and a place that supports my income. The HOA never had a right to it, and now that's been made clear. I still get the occasional glare from Peter if I catch him across the street, but I don't let it bother me. If he ever tries something again, I know my rights, and I have the proof. Plus, after everything that happened, the new board is probably watching him more closely than I am. One neighbor told me they saw Byron and Gretchen searching for a new place out of state, possibly to start fresh. As for me, I'm staying put. This warehouse is my home away from home, and no one's going to take it from me. Since the fiasco, a lot of folks in that area now realize I'm the rightful owner. A few even approached me to apologize for siding with the old board's version of events. Most said they were just confused by the misinformation and false claims. I told them I appreciate the apology and that it's water under the bridge, but I also made it clear that I'm not interested in joining their HOA or paying any membership fees. The new board members assured me that's fine, since legally I was never required to do so in the first place. I did end up installing a nice tall fence around the warehouse lot. It gives me a little more privacy, and it prevents prying eyes from snooping around. Some might find that dramatic, but after all the nonsense, I'd rather be safe than sorry. Whenever someone asks why there's such a robust fence around a small warehouse, I just give them a short summary of this entire saga, and they usually stand there dumbfounded that a group of people could be so blatant in trying to take over a property. One unexpected silver lining: this ordeal pushed me to network with local officials more than I ever had before. By verifying my property lines and updating the warehouse's status with the county, I caught the attention of a couple of local small business groups. They ended up featuring me in a community spotlight for local artisans and craftspeople, which brought in more business. Sometimes life's twists and turns lead to hidden benefits. All in all, that's how I ended up outsmarting an HOA that demanded I pay rent for my own warehouse. They thought I was too poorly dressed and unrefined to be an owner, and they nearly got away with harassing me. But ultimately, the law was on my side. I can confidently say that sometimes you have to stand up, hold your ground, and not back down when you're right, even if you're wearing oil-stained overalls while doing it. The entire fiasco taught me a lesson in perseverance. If you find yourself in a similar position, being bullied by an HOA or a group that thinks they can push you around, always keep your documents in order. Don't be afraid to involve the authorities, and if need be, lawyer up. The moment you show them you're serious about defending your rights, they often back off. I hope this story shows that it's possible to come out on top, even when dealing with overbearing people who judge you by your appearance. I stood up, presented the facts, and fought for what was rightfully mine. In the end, the board members who caused the trouble were either forced to resign or left in disgrace. Peter's lies were exposed, and my warehouse remains under my control, exactly as it should be. Friends, thank you. See you soon.